Go ahead, Nicole.
So, hello everyone. I'm going to introduce myself in my traditional way. First, if you would indulge me. Amasa, Echstam Hana'ax Dawayu, Kitsumkalum, Ouellette, Ganhara, the Bajehkian, Wapsgom. Hello everyone. My name is Nicole Halbauer, is my anglicized name. My Tsimshian name is Hana'ax, which means victorious woman. I'm a member of the Raven clan of Kitsumkalum in the Tsimshian nation, and I'm a member of the House of Gom. So I am coming to you from my own traditional territory on the Skeena River in what is commonly known on the colonized map as Terrace, BC. And I'm really honored and grateful. My heart is full that Amir invited me here to speak this evening. Generally, I don't have anything written down in this type of a conversation because I believe it needs to be a back and forth, and it really has to be something that we participate in together for it to be a really meaningful learning opportunity. So one of the first things is I want to thank those of you that knew whose territory you were on and calling in from. I really appreciate that acknowledgement for those nations, and it's one of those most important things that we can do is to really acknowledge, because even the term using Indians for us was a way to displace us from our territories, our lands, which are so culturally connected to who we are at our heart. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And I'm just here. We are all across Canada very shook this week. But I will say Indigenous people across Turtle Island, we've heard stories from our elders, our parents, our grandparents, our aunts and uncles for generations. This news was not a surprise to us as much as it is a heartbreak. I don't know if many people know, but our elders, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came, but our elders have been telling us this for generations. And then for as long as there has been a colonial government, our elders have been told they were lying, that these graves didn't exist, that these atrocities didn't happen, that they were imagining things, or the worst of the worst, that they were saying these things to get a settlement from the government. So as much as it was hugely despairing, the 215 children that were found, it was also a huge confirmation that for many of us shook and woke up the Canadian populace and said, wait a minute, if this can happen in Canada, and Canada who brands itself as a human rights champion worldwide, then what do we do? And so one of the first things I ask of people in Canada is allyship. What does it mean to you? And just knowing and understanding you have very limited opportunities in this country to learn about the true history of how this country was formed. And it takes a lot of effort to find courses, programs, and speakers that will be honest without blame, and without making people feel guilty for being here. This is a beautiful country, and everyone has a place here. It's not like anyone should feel unwelcome, but there needs to be an acknowledgement that those that came here for the purpose of removing Indigenous people from their land had an agenda. They had a plan. You can see forms of the plan in places like South Africa. It wasn't, we are not the only country with this history, but we are the country that walks through the UN Human Rights Commission with our head up high as though we've never committed any kind of crimes against humanity. And so my first request is always learn about whose territory you're on. Just knowing the name, if you're on Oneida, if you're on Mohawk, if you're on Dene, if you're on Tsimshian, learn how the people of the area identify that territory, because we never had the term terrace. That is just a geographic name for the way the mountains here are formed around this valley. So knowing that, you know, this is Tsimshian territory, that Tsimshian people are matrilineal and matriarchal, and we are strongly tied. Every bit of this area belongs to what we call a WAP. A WAP is our word for a house, but not like the physical house like that we all live in this country, but it's more of a family grouping. And usually all of the same clan, like all of my WAP would all be ravens, that we would identify as Raven clan. And so know that minimal amount, but also in your heart know who is teaching you about this country. Are you learning it from, and are your children learning it from textbooks that are prescribed by the colonial government, in which they are not going to be forthcoming about the genocides and the other atrocities? There's been so many that formed this country. So look for other authors. I know that I often get asked for books that people can read. So I have a list, I call it my decolonization library. And I really focus on having people do a lot of their own work, because part of being an ally, I think the most important part is not asking the people who need the ally to educate you. I know that seems like, oh, well, who else are you going to learn from? But in our day and age where everyone has, like, there's multiple really high degrees in this group, I have complete faith that some research and some time, you guys would know so much about the country. Tanya Talladega, sorry, my tongue isn't working. She wrote for the CBC for many years. She has an excellent book about racism in the healthcare system, and especially
Nicole, your connection is frozen.
For communities in Northern Fall. Oh, hello? Am I talking too long, Amir?
No, your connection got frozen. We lost a little bit of your words, but if you can.
Oh, yeah. Okay, the most important part is look for authors that Indigenous authors that are writing about the truth. So I was saying about Tanya Talladega and Seven Fallen Feathers in Ontario. She writes about the healthcare system and the high suicide rates and why that is. Learn about the culture in the area. If you live in Mohawk territory, what do you know about Mohawk people in the land and their history? And oftentimes what I say is just show up. If you have no words, especially right now, if you have no words, all you have to do is show up. Show up. I know across BC, just in my community, in this week, we've had three memorials for those 215 little souls. And you know what? Allies showed up and they just stood there and they just listened. They didn't try to correct. They didn't try to police the tone or criticize the message or deny the facts. And just know that Canada actually isn't a human rights haven. If you look at the UN's report, every 4 years, Canada, as a member of the UN, has a review, especially this year, it's on the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And one of the main things is in the last report, it was straight Fs, fail across the board for women's human rights in Canada. And that's not known internationally. It's not something as a whole, we're talked about as being polite and so fantastic a place to be. But if you're an Indigenous woman born into poverty in this country, it's a very different world for you. And if you're born in the northern part of the country where resources are even less, it's even more difficult. So one of the things you can do is just really learn about what are the systemic changes that need to happen. Every single person in Canada can make a systemic change or speak up for a systemic change, whether it's in education, science, healthcare, corrections, justice, legal, everywhere. If you're everywhere we are, we can make a change, and we can create a better world for our collective society, or we can continue the othering of us and them. And whenever we do the othering, I feel that we create harm because somebody has less. So one of the most important parts of my culture is to serve others before you serve yourself. And it's ingrained in us very young. Our whole feast system is based on serving others before we serve ourselves. And so it's really important that that is shared out there. And part of it is making sure that we have a just and fair society. And in order to do that, we need to educate ourselves on the past so we don't repeat it, work on changing the systems that we currently live in, and create policies for the future to ensure that my granddaughter inherits a different world than I did. And the only way to do that is to acknowledge the truth first and to work on reconciliation, all of us together. So I think I'm not sure if I talked too long, but I just want to say thank you again. And Doyek Newsom, thank you everybody for this time. And I will take any questions.
Thank you, Nicole. Before I wanted to start our meeting with something, but I forgot. I'm gonna do it now. It's something that I saw today, and it was basically a healing dance by a Squamish girl in West Vancouver. It's I'll just let you see it for yourself. 1 second. Can everyone see my screen now?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, I don't know. Like I didn't know what I didn't know anything about healing dances, and I didn't know anything about the history behind it. She was doing it in honor of those souls lost at Kamloops Indian Residential School. But It was powerful. It's something that moved me since the morning that I saw it. So I thought I would share it with you. Yeah, and before we go to Breen, and Breen wants to, Breen shared a lot of his thoughts that he wants to talk about on Twitter over the past number of days. But I also want to acknowledge the Islamophobia that took 4 lives in Ontario today, and kind of shows that we can't pick and choose, and we're all in this together. However, it is still very important to acknowledge whose territory we live in. And yeah, the land acknowledgement, to me, when I hear it, a lot of times it becomes formality when it comes from politicians. But I hope that it inspires and encourages people to go and learn about the territory, the people on whose territory we have the honor of living. Breen, over to you. Nicole, you wanted to say something?
Oh, I just wanted to say for myself personally, even a bad land acknowledgement is still an acknowledgement that I still exist and I'm still here and this is still my home. So even the bad ones, I'll take it.
Oh, yep, that's learning experience, and that's a learning lesson for me. Over to you, Breen. You're muted.
There we go. Before I begin, Nicole did ask if anybody had questions, so I'd like to cede the floor to questions for Nicole in case there are any. Going once.
Shiva has her hand raised, and Rasul had his hand raised. The reason I didn't go to questions was because because you might have to leave us at 8:30. That's why I wanted to give you time.
I'll be okay.
Okay, if you're fine.
Gonna make it work.
All right, then Shiva, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nicole. I just wanted to say that I'm a mother of 2. And when I came to this land, I didn't know anything about the people who basically owns the land. I felt embarrassed. I felt confused. I felt responsible. That I echoed again, reinforced that occupation, but by my presence in this land. So the first moment that I felt that I can do something about it was to join a group to write a shadow report to the United Nations for the missing and murdered Aboriginal women. Thank you so much. And that moment was the time that I felt that I can start to be active part of healing and do my share of work, and not only be an ally, a passive one, but be a complicit in your fight against colonialism. So please accept me as a member of sisters who are fighting for women's rights. And I do my best to continue this path. And you please lead us, show us the light. We will follow. You're the leaders in this struggle. Thank you so much.
Oh, Shiva. Amir, can you give her my email address? I am writing my first ever shadow report, and I would love to have a conversation with you about that process. So yes, we are always sisters, and you don't need to feel guilty at all. There's no guilt. Even for those who have been here generations, my ancestors would be, my Tsimshian ancestors would be appalled to think anybody would feel guilt over something that they had not done. But the system is what it is. The system is made by people. The system can be changed by people. And that's what keeps me going every day. But Shiva, queue up my email address. Let's write another shadow report because I'm
Sure.
Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Love
Enjoy
that.
it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So Nicole, the same address you emailed me from?
Yes, yes.
Okay, we'll do that. Rasul?
Same idea for all of us. When I came to Canada after so many years, I found about these issues and I felt so bad that I didn't know. And I would like to know more about the communities and their traditions. And I haven't been able to connect with these communities. And I feel like some of the communities are really reserved, and I respect that. But there are communities that are open, and I would say I would like to ask you, like, what is expected here? Is it expected? Is it like someone like me who is curious about these traditions? Is it, shall I just go ahead and approach the communities, or what are the boundaries? I want to be respectful.
Where are you, Russell?
I'm in downtown.
Downtown
Vancouver.
Vancouver. Okay. There's amazing resources downtown Vancouver. And there's the Friendship Center. It's probably the most neutral place to go and get connected. What I like, don't expect to be welcomed in with open arms, because people don't understand, like, we're trying to heal ourselves across this country, right?
Yeah.
So, but if you go and you volunteer at the Friendship Center, no one's going to turn you away because you're free labor. And then you get to know people. Like, I think that's one of the biggest things, that relationship is everything. So it isn't about, like, I get really, and when I say we, I am not talking about the pan-Indigenous ideology of all of us at one. I mean, like, my culture, me, Tsimshian, my house, the people that raised me specifically. We get really leery of people that might feel, because remember, we have 150 something years of people doing this to us, are there to tick a box for their own purpose. Or there to research us, so they get PhDs and big names and book deals, and our community is left with nothing. So I'm always like, if I were to walk up to you on the street and say, hey, Rasul, I want to know everything about you, and you had no idea who the heck I was, and I didn't speak the same language as you, you'd be like, no. So I'm always like, it's not impossible, but you have to stick around long enough to see if you're sincere. And that means, like, volunteering, showing up. And then, you know what, you meet individuals at the Friendship Center. And those individuals, like, I have so many people that are part of my family and part of my life, because you know what, they stuck around. When it was time to wash the dishes for 400 people from a feast, they stuck around until 2 a.m. to do so. Those are my people. And people who, you know, when I was homeless on the street, and they were like, what, how did you get homeless? And I'm like, well, shit happens. They took me in and helped me stand up without ever judging. Those are my people. And so I always go back to that relationship. If you want to know about the culture in your community, do your research first and then build a relationship. Friendship centers. Go be a volunteer, work for free.
Awesome. Well, I guess anybody else wants to jump in, ask questions?
If I can add one thing, for the Vancouver Friendship Center, my distant cousin Cameron Macbeth was working there. I don't know if he still is, but so if you need an introduction, if anybody here needs an introduction, I'll connect you with Cameron.
Do you see how that just worked?
Yeah,
that's how we do it.
Yeah, that would be awesome. If you can do that, I will appreciate that.
Awesome. Well, that's it's good to connect people, and great things happen when we great people connect, I guess. Breen, you want to get started?
Okay. My name is Breen Ouellette. I'm joining all of you from the stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I can't introduce myself in the traditional languages of my ancestors because of the history of colonization in Canada, and my grandfather was the last person in my line to speak our ancestral tongues. I'm far from home, so I started trying to learn a few years back, and then I moved here to Vancouver. My ancestral home is in Saskatchewan. This is a struggle for a lot of Indigenous people, is that our cultural, our things like our language have been taken from us, and we're trying to recapture them. And the reason that they were taken from us in part is because of things like residential schools and things like foster care. These are systems that were used to coerce us into giving up aspects of our culture, or else we would face our children being taken away. But I guess first what I should start with, because I know it's not as common in BC for people to have heard of a Métis person or the Métis Nation. Is anyone here unaware of what it means that I am a Métis person?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll explain it. In the 1600s and 1700s, in the plains of Turtle Island, this continent, this land, and the plains of what is now known Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and part of the western part of Ontario, and down into North Dakota and Montana, European settlers, predominantly French and Scottish settlers, were mixing with the local Indigenous populations, predominantly the nations of the Iron Confederacy. So those would be the Anishinaabe, the Lakota, the Cree, the Saulteaux, and others. The Dene weren't part of the Iron Confederacy, but I have Dene ancestors, and I have Cree ancestors, and I have Nakota ancestors, and I have Saulteaux ancestors. But in the 1700s, these mixings occurred between Europeans and Indigenous peoples, and the children were caught between two worlds. They didn't exactly fit in European cultures and nations. And in Indigenous nations, there was more acceptance, but there was still differences. And so in the early 1700s, mixed peoples, we were called half-breeds at the time, we started to marry each other, and we started to develop our own ways of being a nation, and that was known as the ethnogenesis of the Métis people. We became a distinct group, a distinct nation of people that were closely allied with the other nations of the Iron Confederacy. And with our allies in the Iron Confederacy, we were the military might of the plains for many decades. And for a long time, we kept the European colonizers at bay. We kept them outside. And then my people had a couple of wars with Canada, One was at Red River, which is now known as Winnipeg. And the Métis leader, Louis Riel, managed to negotiate a deal to form the province of Manitoba. And that was supposed to be a good deal for the Métis people, but it ended up that it wasn't. And our people got moved west by colonization. And then at Batoche, we took a stand again. And my ancestors fought the Canadian military at Batoche in 1885. And on the third day, on the final day, sorry, of the Battle of Batoche, in the final hours of the battle, it was clear that the Métis were losing and that the Métis had to retreat. And my third great grandfather stayed behind to sacrifice himself to lay down a suppressing fire so that the other Métis men could retreat. And so my third great grandfather, Joseph Ouellette, died at Batoche at the age of 93 years old from a bayonet wound in the stomach from a Canadian soldier. And my other notable ancestors, my great grandfather was a military man. He was in the Canadian military, and he was quite good with a weapon. And he carried a handgun on his belt until the day he died. And my grandfather was a world famous dog musher. So that's a person that races dogs on a sled. And he had held the world title in the Manitoba World Championship for dog mushing. I brought some things that are Métis symbols. These are sashes that we wear around our waist if we're men, or we wear them over the shoulder if we're women, and they're a symbol of our culture, who we are. I can't talk about them at great length, but they come in different patterns. This was my father's. He died earlier this year, and this was one of the final gifts I received from him. This is an older style of sash known as an Assumption style sash. So the pattern is different, and there's meaning to the colors and the pattern. And then this is what's known as a Dark Times Assumption sash. It's got dark borders. And I wore this sash. I was a lawyer at the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. I conducted over 65 testimonies of witnesses, survivors of violence, and family members who had lost women or girls or two-spirit people. I wore this sash to every hearing that I conducted. So that's a tiny bit about the Métis. I've taught courses to students in college. I've guest lectured, and usually I have 3 hours to talk about it, but we don't have that kind of time tonight. So we'll have to leave it there. I hope that explains a little bit about who the Métis people are. So I wanted to come and talk to you tonight because I'm a lawyer, and I worked at the National Inquiry. I saw and participated in assisting the witnesses to deliver their testimony. I heard their heartbreaking testimonies. I saw the things that that Canada did, even at the National Inquiry, to try to undermine the National Inquiry. Just recently, someone asked me online about why I was saying that the RCMP interfered at the National Inquiry. And the reason is that at the Smithers hearing, so that's very close to Terrace, where Nicole is, at the Smithers hearing, I found out that 3 of my witnesses, 3 families, had been contacted by the RCMP just before they were supposed to give testimony at the National Inquiry. And the RCMP lied to them and said that the National Inquiry and that me as their lawyer had asked the RCMP to meet with my witnesses. And then they held meetings with these family members and they interfered with their testimony. They tried to make them doubt what they were going to say to the commissioners at the national inquiry. And when I found out about it, I worked with my witnesses and they gave public testimony on the record that, that identified the RCMP as trying to interfere with the testimony at the national inquiry. Unfortunately, it received very little press coverage, even though it should have been a very big deal. The RCMP have a long history of oppressing Indigenous peoples in this country, and they're still doing it today. And my worry now with the Kamloops Indian residential school site is that the RCMP are there right now, and they claim to be there to investigate, but I believe that they are there to make it difficult to investigate, to hide evidence, to intimidate the people that have done the good work so far, to uncover the truth. And I think it's important that we get the RCMP out of the site, that they shouldn't be there. And so I have been calling on Canada to allow an international court to come to Canada to investigate the genocide at the residential schools, and also to investigate other genocides that have been happening, other acts of genocide that have happened across Canada. I've been calling on Canada to submit to an international court for apartheid. And most Canadians, most people in Canada don't realize that Canada is a constitutional apartheid. So is everybody familiar with what apartheid is? Does anybody have a question about what apartheid means?
Yeah, we studied about it in Palestine-Israel relationship, but it's understandable within the Canadian context, yes.
Okay, so in Canada, the apartheid is, it's constitutional. So the constitution of a country is the highest law of the country. It's the law that kind of guides and dictates the rest of all the other laws in a country. And in Canada's constitution, there are several documents that form the basis of the Constitution, and one of them is the Constitution Act 1867. And in the Constitution Act, there are sections, Section 91 and Section 92, and each of them sets out the jurisdiction of the federal government in Section 91 and the jurisdiction of provincial governments in Section 92. Now, in Section 91, there are lists of things that the federal government has jurisdiction over. It has jurisdiction over banks, and it has jurisdiction over currency, and it has jurisdiction over copyright. And all of these things in the list are classes of property, or they're classes of legal or economic concepts that have to do with property. Except for one thing. Section 91, sub 24, lists Indians and lands reserved for Indians. That's the exact quote. So in Canada's constitution, the people that are legally known as Indians are a form of property according to the highest law of Canada. And that meets the definition of apartheid. It singles out a race of people, a racial identified group, for restrictive treatment as compared to everybody else in Canada. And Indians, the old legal term for Indigenous people, are the only group of people that are specifically singled out in the Constitution. So Canada's Constitution enshrines apartheid against Indigenous peoples. That means the First Nations people, which is a group that makes up many individual Indigenous nations, and then the Métis people, and then also the Inuit. So we are all to different degrees, we are under the apartheid of Canada, because from that constitutional concept of Section 91, sub 24, other laws are empowered for the government to undertake. So the Indian Act, which is legislation of the federal government that is still in operation today, the Indian Act exists because it is empowered by Section 91, sub 24. And the Indian Act is a way of segregating people who are status Indians. On the other hand, there's also our system of courts, which has derived a number of common law principles and precedents that deal with Indians and Aboriginals, which are two legal terms that essentially mean the same thing. Aboriginals was the new updated word for Indians in 1982. And also common law principles that deal specifically with the Métis and with the Inuit. But those court principles also apply specifically to Indigenous peoples. They're not of general application. They apply to us because of our race, and that is apartheid. So I've been working, especially the last couple of weeks, anytime something big happens and we get a moment for Canada to pay attention to Indigenous peoples, I'm out and I'm advocating and I'm trying to get people to listen that we are living in a constitutional apartheid. We are living in an ongoing genocide, and we need international courts to come to Canada and to investigate and try Canada for its apartheid and genocide. And for the most part, people ignore that. People don't want to hear that, especially non-Indigenous Canadians. But in recent weeks, people have been more sympathetic because the evidence just keeps building. And it's becoming harder and harder to deny that genocide is happening in Canada. I went on the radio last week, and I was asked on because of the 215 children. And the radio host said, it's a terrible thing, 215 children. And I said, yes, but that's only 215 children at one site. And there were 130, more than 130 of these child labor death camps in Canada. And I don't call them schools, I call them child labor death camps because that's what they were. And if we take 215 at one and we extrapolate that out to all of the others in Canada, then there is a possibility that as many as 30,000 children were murdered and secretly buried in Canada. And I'm not the first person to say that. Murray Sinclair, a former judge and one of the commissioners for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has the opinion that the number is closer to 30,000. And so on the radio, I wanted to make it clear, what does 30,000 mean? So I told the host, yes, exactly. Nicole's saying those are the ones not burned in furnaces. There may be bodies that we never find. But so anyway, I wanted the host to really understand what 30,000 means. So I said to her, I did some research. If we take the city of Vancouver or the city of Surrey or the capital region of British Columbia, if we take one of those and we take all the children between the ages of 4 and 15 and we kill them all, then we would have about 30,000 children. And that's the kind of way that we need to explain to people the tragedy, the size of the tragedy, so that they understand. We need to put it in terms that they can see, so that their hearts won't be as cold. I'm gonna leave it there to see if anybody has any questions or anything they want me to follow up on.
Thank you, Breen. Yeah, the floor is open. Just jump in. I guess we all need time to have that sink in.
Breen, maybe you can explain, you mentioned how it's ongoing. Maybe it would be a way to explain to the group, because oftentimes we think this is a lot of the material when you come, when you know how it is, right? So maybe explain why we believe it's why it is ongoing.
Yes, that's a good point, Nicole. Thank you for that. I mean, as a lawyer from that worked at the National Inquiry, I heard a lot of testimony, and a lot of modern testimony from the last 10 years, the last 20 years. And one of the places where the genocide is ongoing is with children in foster care. Indigenous children are overrepresented in foster care by a significant amount, far more than it should be if it was just based on demographics of the rest of the population. In some provinces, the number of children in foster care are as high as 50% are Indigenous, when they only make up 5 to 10% of the total population. And Indigenous children in foster care don't receive good care, based on the testimony that I heard at the National Inquiry. Their children, girls, of course, is what I heard about at the National Inquiry. Girls are generally very susceptible to sexual assault and sexual violence in foster care. And oftentimes the social workers, the government social workers that are assigned to care for these children, they try to hide it. Instead of taking the children out of the home where they're at danger, they'll take the children to the doctor and have them put on birth control. So they're not protecting the children from these violent acts. They're just trying to protect the truth from coming out. They're trying to prevent the truth from coming out. Another way that the genocide is perpetrated is that police in Canada have a long history of oppressing Indigenous people and not working for Indigenous people who have been harmed. And so many times during the National Inquiry, families of women who were lost or murdered would tell us that the police did nothing. They didn't investigate. They didn't take it seriously. They made racist jokes. And there's no recourse. There's nothing that a family can do if the police aren't doing their job, because the way that police are currently held accountable in Canada is broken. Police investigate themselves. Police boards that are made up of former police officers investigate police officers. And Crown prosecutors don't like to charge police with crimes because they also have to work with police day to day. So all these things come together and create a systemic oppression that amounts to genocide. And there are many other things. I could go on and on. There's a huge list, but I know that we've already had a very heavy set of things to talk about, and I can see that I think Shiva has her hand up. I'm not sure how this thing works.
Before Shiva, it was Hassan and then Shiva.
Okay,
So
if you could manage that. It's hard for me on my phone.
No problem. I'm glad. Actually, you have the best setup. I didn't know that it was phone. But yeah, please keep your questions as brief as you can so that we cover as many things as we can. Hassan?
Thank you very much, Breen. It was very informative presentation. I know a little bit about the Métis history, but you very detailed. You give a lot of information. Thank you, Nicole.
I could give you a lot more.
Yes, and as Shiva said, I never feel as a coming here as a settler or something. I feel as a colonialist, make a slavery system in the global size. I come here as a slave, even side by side of you, as the colonial treatment is everywhere, is not just Canada, and they make it the system based on the capital and profit, and they make the human division, and slavery is continue in the different form and different shape, and always I feel it in the other side of the world or here, side by side of you, fighting with the colonial system and the related to capitalist system. Without the capitalism, is impossible colonial system continue this level and discrimination. The Breen very well described. My question is if the Breen give the more information. We know the reconciliation has a 92 or 93 item for many years as a resolution for the making the hill. But under the leadership of the Liberal Party as a government, my knowledge is just the 10 piece of that resolution is it looks like lip service, same as the propaganda about the sorrow, about the finding, we are side of the nationality, but as a main point of the indigenous demand, same as the landowner, and they stop the pipeline, stop the making dam, and occupy those heavy politic power. They don't do anything. And how much power remain, how much needs remain, and what we have to do about that. If the Breen give an explanation about that, I really appreciate it.
Okay. Well, okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to try to be brief about it. The 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are only one piece of the recommendations that have existed in Canada. Before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the 90s, there was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. It's known as RCAP. And they made a number of recommendations that were intended to make the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples better. And those recommendations were largely ignored. And then the recommendations of the TRC have been largely ignored. And then after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there was the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And that's where I worked. And that commission made 231 calls to justice. So 231 more recommendations that have been largely ignored. But the other thing is that all three of these, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, were all commissions of the colonizer. They were all set up by Canada's government. They got their authority from Canada's government, and they got their funding from Canada's government. And so you can see, especially with the national inquiry, when it started to get too uncomfortable and the national inquiry requested more money to continue its work, the Canadian government said, no, we're setting an end date. We're going to give you enough to finish what you've started, but we're not going to let you do everything. And these are the dangers with federal Canadian commissions. The other thing that many of my witnesses would say is that when you look at the 231 calls to justice of the national inquiry, or you look at the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there's no real talk about criminal justice for the people who are still alive who committed these crimes. And once again, I believe that's influenced by the federal government. They don't want to have criminal charges brought against people that have participated in apartheid and genocide, because some of the highest regarded politicians in Canada would be charged with crimes. Jean Chrétien is a famous liberal prime minister. Well, in the 19th, very few people know this, but it's in the parliamentary Hansard record. Hansard record is the writing down of everything that's said in question period and during committees at the House of Commons and the Senate. And on the Hansard record in the 1970s, the leader of the NDP at the time, Mr. Lewis, asked Jean Chrétien, who was the Minister of Indian Affairs, what he was going to do to stop Inuit women from being sterilized in the North. And Mr. Chrétien denied that Inuit women were being sterilized in the North. And then 2 weeks later, Mr. Chrétien said on the record again that there were no sterilizations in the North, that it was a misunderstanding. So Jean Chrétien knew about it. We all know it happened now in large numbers, but he knew about it then, and he had the opportunity to stop it, and he didn't, which means he should answer for genocide. And there's not a lot of appetite for that among politicians. They don't want to be personally held responsible as criminals for what's happened in this country. But on the other hand, it's becoming extremely difficult for Canada to deny what's going on, because Indigenous people and our non-Indigenous allies and accomplices keep bringing forward the evidence. We keep holding them this evidence, and we say, this is what's happening. And it gets harder and harder for them to send it away. So we have to keep holding that evidence up. We have to keep making the rest of the world aware, because they think that Canada is a perfect country that's never done anything wrong. So we need to make sure that we tell the rest of the world, and we need to call on our leaders wherever they are, leaders in our community, leaders in our religious organizations, leaders in our city and our province, and the federal government. We need to call on all these leaders to support international courts investigating and trying the crimes of genocide and apartheid in Canada, because it's the only way that we will see true justice, possibly. There's never a guarantee with a court, but if we let the criminal also be the judge, I can guarantee you there's never going to be justice. It needs to be somebody who isn't doing these crimes to us that has to be the judge. Does that make sense?
I suppose so. So we have we have time for a brief comment from Jen, and then we go to Rasul and Shiva.
Tell you what, why don't we let Rasul ask his question, and then we'll see if we can fit me in at the end.
Sure. Rasul, do you want to go?
Sure. Thanks for your information. I have a question regarding Trudeau's he asked Vatican City to apologize about this situation, and the Pope didn't actually, he refused to do that. Can you tell us about what you think what's happening on that level? Is it Trudeau, is he trying to kind of, put the pressure on somebody else? Or what do you think about the Vatican City? Do they have any role on this matter or not?
Well, I think that as a matter of politics, Mr. Trudeau is trying to take the heat and put it somewhere else, and that the Catholic Church is a good option because the Catholic Church hasn't even properly apologized. But the crimes that were committed in Canada by the Catholic Church were done under the authority of the government of Canada. So as a lawyer, I always look at who is ultimately responsible, who's the kingpin, who's the boss. And in this case, it's the federal government of Canada. They allowed those residential schools to be set up by virtue of Section 91, sub 24 of the Constitution Act 1867. They relied on their power over Indigenous peoples under Canadian law to do these things to us and to allow other people to do these things to us, like the Catholic Church, like the Anglican Church, like the other churches. So as a lawyer, I say you start at the top and you work your way down. And we will get to the Catholic Church starting from the Canadian government and working our way down. Now, the Vatican is a separate entity from Canada with diplomatic status. So we may not be able to get the same justice from them as we can from Canada. But on the other hand, the Vatican has a lot of assets in Canada. They have a lot of churches and money in Canada. So if we can get an international court to come into Canada and have the authority to make decisions here, then it's possible that that court could order the assets of the Vatican frozen throughout Canada, and that would create an immense financial and political pressure on the Vatican to submit to the court.
Thank you.
I just have one quick thing that the way I think about it, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm a criminologist, so Breen can correct me. But you know, the Catholic Church, this is somewhat sacrilegious. So the Catholic Church has their Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. Well, I consider the Canadian government has their Holy Trinity of terror, and that is the federal Canadian government, the RCMP, and the Catholic Church. Keeping in mind, the Catholic Church didn't come here and set up residential schools. The Canadian government, everything that Breen just said about apartheid, the Canadian government created these prisons for children. They created the policy and the funding formula. So every time one of our prime ministers says there's no money for it, it just makes me want to vomit. They created the funding system to fund the churches to do this. So they're like the contractor and the contract killer situation. And the way you got those children away from their parents, believe me, nobody sent their children willingly, was at gunpoint with an RCMP officer on the other end. So that's the Holy Trinity of terror. That's the truth of Canada. That's the foundation of the Canadian law. And that is why we have to keep fighting, and to turn this around and to create the change. That is why allyship is so important.
And then to add on to what Nicole just said, that trinity of evil in Canada has evolved into the foster care system. And you have the federal government at the top. You have the RCMP in the middle, and you have the provincial foster care systems at the bottom. And in the current landscape, because of Section 9124, the federal government is responsible for Indians. If an Indigenous child gets taken into foster care by a province, that province receives money from the federal government every month for the care of that child. And they use that money to benefit non-Indigenous people in their province. And they, in some cases, like Alberta, they have set up a huge criminal racket where they have the police, whether it's RCMP or municipal police, and they have social workers, and they have doctors and psychologists all working together as a team. And they go in and they take the child from the parents on an allegation that the parents are unfit. And then the money starts flowing from the federal government into the province. And then as the parents try to fight to get their children back, every time the province goes to court, they're paying a doctor or they're paying a psychologist incredible amounts of money for legal reports to fight to keep the children in foster care. And those reports, in one instance, and this is fairly common, the psychologist wrote a 30-page report and she got paid $24,000 for that report. And that $24,000 came from the federal government. So the provinces see Indigenous children as a way to make money. As someone said, it comes back to capitalism and the perverse ways that capitalism will treat people as property and as a resource to wring profit from us. And they're doing it to Indigenous children. And they're mostly doing it because they can profit from it.
Yeah, and to add on to that, and don't think this is past, because I tried to take my nephew out of the foster care system, and it took 6 years, and I couldn't get the mental health and physical health his needs met. So I tried to get more help for him, and they said I wasn't able to access that because I am kith and kin, meaning I was his family member trying to take him out of the foster care system. So we couldn't get the assessments or resources that he needed. I had to put him back in foster care, which broke me. And within 1 week, the non-Indigenous, non-family member not only received almost triple a monthly supplement for him to meet his needs, but he had a 3-week stay at BC Children's for the assessment that I had cried for 8 years. So this is new. It's not new. It's happening now. It's not history. It's current. These are things. This is why I fight every day. This is policy. People make policy, policy can change. System should be there to serve the people. People shouldn't be serving the system. And my nephew is why I keep going, because kith and kin shouldn't matter. If you are family, you should have just as many resources when you're trying to help two family members, the mother and the child. And anyway, I'm getting fired up. Sorry, Jen, I'm using your time.
No, that's totally fine. And before we get to Jen, if anybody else has a question, feel free to jump in. And I want to share my screen one more time, speaking of Canada and other things. I think you guys can all see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, yep, this is what I wanted to show. Anyway, anybody else has something to say? If not, we go to Shiva.
Yeah, thank you so much, Breen. I believe that Indigenous people played pivotal role in the development of International Convention on the Right of Indigenous People in a global arena, and definitely going to International Criminal Court is a noble way to deal with this situation. But you mentioned the criminal investigations that are needed in these cases, made me realize that how the reconciliation and the usage of that language is different in the language of public inquiries and the language of Supreme Court of Canada. When reconciliation is referred into the language of public inquiries, it's about like transitional justice, it's about societal healing, allyship, and the things that we are just discussing. But the use of that word, that terminology in the Supreme Court of Canada is so violent. I think that usage is quite the opposite direction of reconciliation as a healing. How we can reconcile Crown sovereignty with Aboriginal sovereignty, how we can do that. How we can reconcile the existing, pre-existing Aboriginal laws with the colonial laws of Canada today. These reconciliations in the legal world appear impossible to me. How do you see the reconciliation of sovereignty, which is the most important part of my question? Are we going to have two sovereignty in one nation? How do you see that?
Well, it's interesting. You've picked up on something that even very few lawyers pick up on. It's something that I commented on earlier this week. The definition of reconciliation at the Supreme Court of Canada, I'm going to paraphrase it. It's a slightly different than what you said. You're very close, but the Supreme Court of Canada has called Canada, the country's control over the territory, de facto control. And it's just one line in one decision, but it speaks volumes, because de facto is Latin for in fact. Whereas if the Supreme Court of Canada wanted to say that Canada had legal control of the land, the Supreme Court would have said de jure control of the land. But they don't use that term. They use the term factual control. And the reason that Canada only has factual control is because Indigenous people were here first. They're the rightful owners of the land. And no amount of legal fiction will change that. It's impossible to say that Indigenous peoples weren't here first, occupying the land in a legal way. And so when the Supreme Court of Canada talks about reconciliation as they've defined it, it's taking the fact that Canada only has control by its force and occupation, whereas Indigenous people have good right to own the land. And reconciliation is to cause Indigenous people to join Canada and forget about their ownership of the land. It's a new form of assimilation using very tricky language that confuses people, especially the average person who understands reconciliation to mean the natural definition of the word, not this strange legal concept. So now the International Court brings us justice for individuals by charging them with crimes of genocide and apartheid and other crimes against humanity. But there are other international courts that we also need help from, because we need a court like the International Court of Justice to try Canada for its legislative apartheid. And that means the doctrine of discovery that the Pope in the 1493, just around the 1500s, the Pope declared the doctrine of discovery, which basically said that European countries could take the land from Indians because Indians weren't real people, because we weren't Christian. And then the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which is where the King of England said that he was claiming all the land that essentially makes up Canada because he had defeated the French at New France, which we know as Quebec. And then you've got the Constitution Act of 1867, which sets out that Indians are property under the control of the federal government. We've got all these pieces of law and legislation, and then all the things at the Supreme Court, like the definition of reconciliation, which is racist. We've got Indian title and Aboriginal title, which is a racist concept that was developed at the Supreme Court of Canada. All of these ideas have to be destroyed. They need to be taken out of the system, or we'll never be able to escape genocide. As long as the idea is in the law, even known to only a few people, but in the law, that Indigenous people are property and that the federal government can do what they want with us, there will always be oppression of Indigenous people. And so we need a court like the International Court of Justice to come in and review our laws and repeal all the apartheid, repeal all of the things that say that Indigenous peoples aren't the rightful owners of the land. Once it's been cleared up that Indigenous nations are the sovereign owners of the land, then we can start to see reconciliation, because then Indigenous peoples and nations will be on the same footing as Canada, even arguably a better footing than Canada. And I know that Indigenous peoples just want to coexist. We want to share the land in peace and for the benefit of everyone. And we need to get our land rights back and recognized as the proper land rights of this land, so that we can come up with new ways of governance. Someone recommended to me the other day, wouldn't it be interesting if we got rid of the unelected Senate and we elected people from each Indigenous nation in Canada to be senators, and we got rid of the British Crown, and we said that the Senate represented the sovereignty of Indigenous nations in Canada, and that's where that would be the sovereignty that would replace British sovereignty in a new system of government. It's an interesting idea. I can't say for sure that it's one that every Indigenous nation would want to sign on to, but it's an interesting idea. And there are many different ways that we could forge a new relationship to share these lands in a way that benefits everyone. But we can't do it until we remove the poison of apartheid from the legal system of Canada.
Thank you, Breen. We're getting very close to the end. I don't mind keeping us for another few minutes. But Jen, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Breen and Nicole, for sharing your thoughts today. I am coming to you as a settler from the unceded territories of the Kwiklet, Tsleil-Waututh, and Stoney people. And I am on the opposite side, in a way, to Breen and Nicole. I'm a descendant of the first European baby born in North America. And so my family has been here for many, many hundreds of years, but that does not give me any more rights than any other person who is here today as a new settler. And this is a very difficult conversation, because when I was growing up in the Canadian educational system and as part of the white society, we did not discuss anything about Indigenous peoples, Indigenous rights, residential schools. There was never a conversation. This did not happen. And that cannot continue, right? That cannot continue, because my children and Nicole's children and grandchildren, we need to share this land, and we need to share it in respect. And children do not need to face the same situation where they discover these things so late in their life and have to be educated on them by people who shouldn't have to do that work for them. So Amir asked me, because what I do is I am a school trustee, and I work in the public K-12 public education system, and to just provide some of the examples of the way that this systemic situation still plays out today. So that would be, for us in education, we track First Nations, Indigenous, Aboriginal students separately from the rest of the school population. And that tracking shows us that today, even today, students graduate at a lower rate. But those decisions are made much earlier in the school system and are made up of larger systemic things, and also smaller decisions that happen every day in the classroom. So one of the things that you can see is before graduation, before we ever get there, is that First Nations and Indigenous students will be assessed differently than any other student in the population. So there is a gap between the participation of Indigenous and First Nation students in say, for instance, gifted and challenge programs. And that exactly matches the gap that you see in those students being assessed for behavioral issues. So there's a 6% gap in participation for Indigenous students in gifted education, but a 6% higher rate where they are assessed for behavioral issues. So those are some of the very practical and real life effects that continue on and are perpetuated in the system today. And there's many other examples that I could give where those gaps and different school systems are trying to tackle those issues, sometimes individually and sometimes with the guidance of the nations that are within their districts, and sometimes with the partnership of different organizations. But we don't have a lot of time, so I'm gonna let that go there today, and thank Amir for hosting, and again for Nicole and Breen for sharing.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, everyone, for coming. If anyone wants to have the last word, please jump in.
This is Breen. I don't want the last word, but Nicole mentioned, this just came back to me. Nicole mentioned reading Indigenous authors. And there's an author that I can recommend. His books are a little dated. He's no longer with us. He is a Métis man and a leader and an academic. His name is Howard Adams. And Howard actually, in his later years, he moved out to Vancouver from Saskatchewan, and he lived here until he died. But he grew up in Saskatchewan in the 1920s and 30s, and he was the first Métis person to ever gain a doctorate at a university. He gained his doctorate of education, and he went into Métis politics, and he wrote about it. And that is a place where you could learn some of the Métis history that even very few Métis people know, unless they've read his books, because during that period of time, from like the 1920s to the 1970s and 80s, the government was doing its best to separate Métis people from our closest relatives, like the Cree. So, for example, I have cousins who have the last name Ouellette. They're third cousins, and they're status Indians in Saskatchewan. whereas you know, I'm considered Métis, and I couldn't go to One Arrow Reserve in Saskatchewan and go hunting with my Ouellette cousins because they're status Indians and I'm Métis, and that's illegal in Canada. So read Howard Adams if you get a chance. He's not the best. I'm gonna admit he's not the best author. He's not a great writer, but he'll teach you some things you definitely didn't know about Métis people.
Well, I would like to ask both Nicole and Breen to, if they come up with other book titles that we need to read, to send them to me, and I'll share them with the group. One thing that I'm reading over the past number of weeks, and this was before the horrifying announcements coming out, is this book. And basically, Louis Riel, Let Justice Be Done. It's a fiction. Basically, from my understanding, is that Louis Riel, and correct me if I'm wrong, Breen, asked for an inquiry into his trial because basically they just made sure that he gets executed. And this is the story of what if there was an inquiry, and what did Louis Riel had to say in that inquiry. And knowing a thing or two about the justice system of the country that I came from, this just pushed it to a whole new level. Like the whole mockery of justice in Riel's trial, and for me, it's very eye-opening. But yeah.
Well, Louis Riel was a really controversial person, even among Métis people. so you have to read a lot of books to get a really good sense about him. But a lot of people don't realize that he was elected as an MP to the House of Commons multiple times, and he was prevented from ever taking his seat as a member of Parliament because another member of Parliament put a contract on his head. I think it was $5,000 to kill Louis Riel so that he can't enter the House of Commons.
Wow.
I just want to touch on something Breen said, because it's something that impacts, like, the fact that Breen can't go hunting and fishing in his own territory with his own family is something that it really impacts us. And it's part of the discrimination against Indigenous women written into the Indian Act. My own children, my one daughter is a language teacher and my son is former Canadian military. And they also cannot, they were born, raised, speak our language, know more of our language and culture than I do. Born on the reserve, like this plot of land the government says where we belong, and they cannot hunt or fish or have access to any of the rights of an Indigenous person because they are not status because the government has decided that if they can't steal our children, they can't outright kill us, what they'll do is legislate us out of existence. And that's what their Indian Act does to prevent us from accessing our rights. And so it all ties into the fact that Breen can't live out his culture on his land with his family. My children can't live out theirs, even though they have lived it their whole lives. And this is a piece of paper. And I always go back to, well, what do you want? Well, I want that piece of paper burned, and I don't want to be under it anymore. And I don't want to be a piece of property. And I believe it's possible. I have to believe it's possible or I would give up. And I want every single piece of curriculum in this country to talk about what has happened. And most importantly, I want whoever our prime minister is to stop walking around the UN as though they're some sort of human rights defender and acknowledge what has been done and start making change, and that the rest of the world quits looking at Canada like it's some haven for human rights, because it isn't. And so this is where I go back to all the time. And this is what gets me up in the morning and keeps me going. I want the foster care system changed. I want the education system changed. I want the justice system changed. They created the RCMP to police the Indigenous people. They can change the RCMP and they can create other organizations and institutions to help us heal as a nation, all of us together. Because unless we do it together, it's not going to work. If it's put on all of the Indigenous people to fix what their abuser did to them, that's just messed up. So together we can make the change, but it requires allyship and it requires will. And the last UN paper I read yesterday was a response to Canada's report, and it's clearly stated that Canada has a lack of will. That's all it is, a lack of will. Sorry, I have to mute now. My dogs are going crazy.
Thank you, Nicole. If anybody else has something to say, please go. If not, I would close it. Shiva?
No, many, many thanks. I'm really grateful for this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think, sorry, go ahead.
Go, no, go ahead.
I think I sent it. I tried to text through a website. It's jointhecall.ca. It's a petition. If you sign it, it goes to your member of parliament and to the prime minister and one of the Indigenous affairs ministers, and it asks them to allow international courts to come into Canada.
Yes, I think that's. I think we'll share it in our Telegram group as well. Well, thank you for coming. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Breen. Thank you, Jen. Thank you to everyone who joined us. I like to close by saying something that I said it previously. I'm president and founder of Farsi-speaking, and Shiva is helping us with as our incoming VP in that organization. And that's actually the first time I met Breen. I gave him a button for our organization.
I still have it.
Yay. Now, it's, you know, we started this organization to make sure that we keep our language and culture for our kids and to share it with our neighbors. And this is exactly what the presidential schools were meant to deny, to prevent, to kill a culture, to kill language. And the children who were there in those death camps, they were there because of their language, because of their culture, and because the colonialists wanted to kill it. So, yes, thank you. I like to take a photo of this.
I'm just going to speak for a second. I'm going to take the view away. Hopefully you can see what I'm holding up in front of my camera here. This is the button I received from Amir a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that's that was the first time we met. So it's very important, like for us as an organization, as Farsi-speaking people, because we can't, in good conscience, sit back and just ignore the people who were here before us and how some the colonialists wanted to kill their culture, their language, hence the cultural genocide. Yeah, and getting back to that healing dance that I saw from that little girl, I'm glad that the resilience and of that culture outlived some of those original colonialists, and I hope that we can make sure that we move towards reconciliation together. It's going to be a conversation that we should have as new settlers and the Indigenous people, and I'm, at least personally, I'm dedicated to that. I'm committed to that, and I'm sure that the others in this call are as well. With that, thank you for coming, and have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.